Я уже забыла. Education for the future. Ну, я уже даже по-русски забыла, как это.
Thank you, Ludmilla. Bernadette, thank you, Madam President. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to have the task of opening this conference that's dealing with these kinds of issues, which are very profound and very urgent as the human race considers its future. I have spent many, many years in this part of the world. I had the privilege of working very directly with Mikhail Gorbachev for many years. I happened to be the last foreigner that he received in his office in the Kremlin before he resigned the presidency on December 24th, 1991. And in January of 1992, he and I met again in his new offices on Leningradsky Prospect, and that began a interactivity that led to the founding of the Gorbachev Foundation in the United States, the State of the World Forum, and convening conferences like this literally all over the world. And so I have been in Moscow many times. At one point I had an apartment there because I was traveling back and forth so much. There was one instance with Mr. Gorbachev with which I would like to open my remarks, and I hope will be a keynote for this conference, because I think all of us understand that not only is this conference being convened, but human relations are being transacted at this time in our history, where major issues are needing to be addressed about how we're treating each other, how we're treating the earth, how we're understanding the nature of consciousness, the nature of education, and the design that we want to embark upon in our future. In May of 1992, we took Mr. Gorbachev to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, which is the premier institution on foreign policy matters in the United States. And he gave his lecture. When he finished his lecture, Henry Kissinger, who was the dean of the Council on Foreign Relations, asked the first question. And he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, why did you fall? Why were you forced to resign?" And Mr. Gorbachev initially was taken aback. And then he said something I'll never forget. He says, "There were many political and economic reasons for my fall. But the essence was, I did not analyze reality ruthlessly enough." And that hit me like a diamond bullet. And if there's one thing that I've endeavored to do since then, is I've lived my life and built the institutions in which I've been involved. It's to start with as ruthless an analysis of reality as I possibly can. So this morning, in just a very few minutes, I would like to set forth my analysis of human reality circa 2013. And I believe that there are 4 major megatrends, 2 negative and 2 positive, that are shaping the human condition at the present time. To start with the negatives first. The single greatest megatrend influencing and shaping planetary affairs now is the escalating crisis of climate change. Several months ago, scientists announced that we have now passed the milestone of 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. In the pre-industrial times, it was only at about 285, 286 parts per million. We are emitting collectively into the atmosphere every 24 hours over 100 million tons of carbon dioxide. It's the equivalent in terms of heat of several hundred Hiroshima bombs every 24 hours. And as a result, for the first time in planetary history, for the 4.5 billion years that our Earth has been here, a species is dramatically influencing the climate of the planet, and doing so in a very short period of time by unleashing major gases into the atmosphere that should have been kept into the Earth. Now, there are many things that I can say about this, but I want to summarize very briefly the following. The major result is the increase in frequency and severity of extreme weather events. Since 1985, the number of extreme weather events have increased fourfold. There was the drought, you will remember, here in Moldova, in the Ukraine, and Russia in 2009. You probably witnessed on the news the Hurricane Sandy in New York that flooded the city of New York. Where I live in California several years ago, in one afternoon, there were 1,900 lightning strikes that caused that many fires across the state of California that in 24 hours burnt down 1 million square acres of land. All of us the world over, whether it's typhoons in Bangladesh, hurricanes, floods, droughts, are being victimized by the fact that we relentlessly are burning fossil fuel. One of the results is the melting of the glaciers, the melting of the ice on Greenland, the Arctic, the Antarctic. Scientists predict that when all the melt has happened, sea levels will rise about 75 meters. Think about what that means. There are 220 major seaports around the world. If we don't stop global warming, all those seaports go underwater. That's St. Petersburg. That's London. That's Rio de Janeiro. That's Sydney. That's Los Angeles. That's San Francisco. And it's already started. One of the consequences of this is rising civil strife. They released a study about a month ago saying that of the 17 countries where we've had civil strife in the last 3 years, every single one of them had major climate change activity as the substrate of the civil disturbances. Syria. We're all focused on chemical weapons. But Syria today is experiencing the worst drought in its entire history. And the history of Syria goes back 10,000 years. The drought is so severe that upwards of 70% of all the small farmers have been forced off the land. We think of the Arab Spring, and we think of Tahrir Square and the young people with their Twitter accounts fomenting revolt. But in Tunis and in Egypt, the civil unrest was not started by a demand for democracy. The civil unrest was started by a demand that the government lower the food prices. Because one of the effects of escalating climate change is turbulence in the farmland and a collapse of the world food supply. So climate change is number one. And it's affecting everybody all over the world, whether you're transpersonal or you're not. Number two is the rise of national security states. In the face of climate change and the prospect that if we do not stop global warming, civilization itself will be forfeit, our governments are essentially doing nothing. And we all know that. Furthermore, in virtually every country in the world, our governing elites are stripping down the social resilience that we need to deal with the crises that climate change produces. It's happening in Moldova. It's happening in Russia. It's happening all over Europe. It is certainly happening in the United States. Education is being stripped. Social services are being stripped. And people more and more are being forced to deal with their future on their own. There's another aspect. We are the first generation in the history of the world to be what I would call post-privacy. And the national security states would probably be better called, as Edward Snowden put it, national surveillance states. The government of the United States monitors all the phone calls going internationally everywhere. Our National Security Agency is monitoring every phone call going in and out of Moldova, going in and out of Russia, with huge computer systems that are placing on permanent record your emails, your phone calls, your texts, your Twitter feeds. And what that means is that while there may not be an observable police state, if they do start to focus on who you are completely defenseless and without any civil libertarian defenses against their capacity to monitor everything that you're doing and to arrest and keep you without trial for as long as they want. And in the United States, they now have the right to execute you if necessary, if there's a suspicion that you're a terrorist. We don't live in democracies anymore. And we all need to understand that. We live in what I would call totalitarian democracies. They let us vote, but money rules. The major corporate interests control. And so these two megatrends of climate change on the one hand and the increasing disruption of our ecological equilibrium and the creation of national security states on the other hand is something that every person in the world has to understand is the context within which we now live and breathe and have our being. There are two other megatrends. One is the burgeoning innovation of technology, the extraordinary paradox of our time is that we're not in a crisis because we don't have the technology that can solve the problem. We're in a crisis because we are not willing politically to use technologies that are already here. 1 hour of sunlight, if fully absorbed and utilized, could provide most of the world's energy needs right now. We have wind, we have geothermal, we have all kinds of things in nature, little algae that can eat up oil spills, mushrooms that will eat up nuclear radiation spills, and they're not being employed. So when we talk about a consciousness revolution, it could not be more urgent. And number 4, which is the supreme paradox of it all, even though there's only a couple hundred of us in this room, we in fact are the moral majority. Now let me unpack that for a moment, because we are far more powerful than we can possibly imagine. If you went back in Europe 1,000 years ago, there was only one value system, and that was the church, the mother church. And then beginning in the 1400s, the Renaissance emerged, and then the Enlightenment. And there began to move into the European consciousness a new value proposition that was based not on the church but human reason, not on the Bible but the scientific method. And for several centuries, as we all know from our history books, much blood was spilt in the 30 Years' War, in the 100 Years' War, in the Reformation, in the Inquisition, over this question of which value proposition was going to be allowed to hold sway. There's still conflict between the church and secular society. But coming into the 20th century, the traditionalists, the conservatives, and the modernists, the scientific secular consciousness, had reached, I would say, an uneasy equilibrium. In the United States, it was about 50-50. Half of the people were traditionalists, half of the people were secularists. Then in about 1960s, sociologists began to observe a new phenomenon that at first they didn't understand, and it kept growing. 2%, 3%, then 5%, then 10%. And now in the United States, 35% of all the American adults are what Paul Ray calls cultural creatives. Similar studies have been done all over Europe and in Japan. Who are the cultural creatives? They're the people that have gone through the social movements that have characterized the post-war world. Civil rights, environmental, gay, lesbian, preventing cruelty to animals, the transpersonal movement. The people who are better informed, looking for new ideas. They're also the people who are very deeply spiritual, but they're not religious, which is a new phenomenon in Western civilization, if not human history. 100 years ago, if you were spiritual, you were religious. You were either a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. Or in India, you would be a Hindu. In China, you would be a Confucianist. I would dare say if we took a poll of this room, most of you are deeply spiritual and very few of you are orthodox religious. Cultural creatives embrace technology. We all have our cell phones. We're online. But we also are environmentally concerned, and we embrace community. Cultural creatives are pragmatically political. They're not ideological. They just want to solve the problem and get together with people in a similar vein. The irony of the cultural creatives, which are now the moral majority of certainly Western civilization, and studies are indicating most of the cosmopolitan cities around the world, is this. Cultural creatives look out into the world, and it's the traditionalists and the modernists that control the media, control the civic institutions, control the religious institutions, and control the prevailing culture. So the cultural creatives feel that they're alone. They've done studies all over the world. And the feeling of isolation, the feeling, well, I'm the only one here in CHISHINAU that is transpersonal, is universal. But it's extraordinary. The studies done on the cultural creatives indicate that there's more of a similarity between a cultural creative in Tokyo and Moscow than there are similarities between the cultural creative in Tokyo and his or her Japanese neighbor, or in Moscow with Vladimir's Russian neighbor, which means that the cultural creatives is not a Western phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. And it's emerging just like the technologies right at the moment when our crisis demands a systemic, fundamental change in consciousness. And so the single most crucial question before us, whether it's in a transpersonal conference or a conference on renewable energy, or in the transition towns seeking to innovate at the community level, is how do we reach critical mass? So let me summarize. If you look at these four megatrends together, climate change, the rise of the national security state and the national surveillance state, burgeoning technologies that could solve the problem, and this emerging of a new consciousness that has not happened for 800 years since the Renaissance. You have four contradictory megatrends that are interacting very unpredictably. And as Lester Brown has said, he follows these matters extremely closely. We're in a race of tipping points, because we never know where a development in one sector is going to burst out and how it's going to affect the whole. Our generation, perhaps more than any generation in certainly recent history, is experiencing what they call black swan events. Black swan events are events that are considered to be impossible by the conventional wisdom, and then all of a sudden they happen, and then once they happen, everybody says, well, yeah, that was inevitable. It's called black swan, by the way, because British scientists asserted categorically that there was no such thing as a black swan. And then in Australia, they found some. 9/11, September 11th, 2001 was a black swan event. The rise of Gorbachev was a black swan event. A week before Gorbachev, there was not a Sovietologist in the world that predicted that Gorbachev would articulate glasnost and perestroika. What happened in South Africa with Mandela and de Klerk and the emergence of democracy there in 1995 was a black swan event. The totalitarian system here in Eastern Europe and in Russia and the Soviet Union was considered so powerful that even after Gorbachev, nobody expected the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it happened over a weekend. So when you're in an integrated system with all kinds of tipping points happening in an unpredictable way, you get black swan events. And what that means for all of us contemplating the future of transpersonal is we need to all understand, in my view, that context matters. The transpersonal movement cannot be seen as a private thing that you do in your own personal life and has nothing to do with anything else. Transpersonal is political. Transpersonal is ecological. It's cultural. It's social. We're all living in a world of the butterfly effect, where the flap of a butterfly's wings over China eventually causes a storm over Moldova, or the United States, or Peru. And in this new interactivity, how we act and what we do matters more than we can possibly imagine, because small perturbations in the system, if they ricochet through the total system, can have extraordinary effects. Which leads me to the final area that I want to explore. What do you do in the face of climate change? What do you do in the face of a national security state that is monitoring everything that you're communicating, that can access your bank accounts, that can even use your cell phone when it's turned off to listen to what you're saying? I believe that the beginning of what we must do was put into a single phrase by Albert Einstein. And I'd like to call it to all your memory because I know you all know it. When he said that the consciousness that produced the problem cannot solve the problem. That is probably the truest thing I know. And what it means is that we need to understand that the nature of social change is not so much petitioning our governments to do the right thing in a world where we may have actually passed the point of no return, particularly on climate change, as we have to put our petard into the ground and recreate the world anew. To the degree to which we can have the strength individually and in our numbers. For example, here in Moldova, in the face of the grip of the scientific reductionist establishment here, to found the Conference on Transpersonal. That is founding the new. And it's worth remembering that the Renaissance was not started by an explosion of art. What happened in Florence, beginning in the fall of 1402, was two Florentine chancellors of the city decided that the crisis that Florence was undergoing was so severe, there was nothing they could any longer do to change the problem. So what did they do? It was Bruno, a man named Bruno, and a man named Sabatati. They decided to change the educational system of Florence and do something completely counterintuitive. And they held a series of meetings. And they decided we need to shift the basis of education away from the church to the Greco-Roman civilization, away from the Bible to human reason. And that's what they called civic humanism. And it was the change in education, a new basis for education that ignited what we now remember as the Renaissance. The transpersonal movement needs to create the world anew and dedicate itself, in my view, as we're doing in this conference, to educating toward a new kind of human consciousness. It's the only thing left for us to do. In the faith that the small little acts that we commit, even here, like acts elsewhere, can be taken by the spirit that governs the affairs of humankind, like a little speck of dust in a gust of wind. And then great change takes place. The grounding of this new way of being in the world, I believe, and there are many of you who know a lot more about transpersonal than I do, but my view that the grounding we need to create the world anew is in shamanic consciousness. Why do I say that? At a time when the world itself is being made more turbulent and the earth is rising and may slough us off as a species if we're not careful, the greatest grounding of spirituality is not in the Bible. It's not in the Quran. It's not in Torah. It's not in the Upanishads. It's not in the Analects. It's in the earth herself. What was the shaman? The shaman was many things. But at the most fundamental, what the shaman does is the shaman knows the language of nature and the language of society. The laws of the invisible realm and the laws of the visible realm. The shaman is the translator between the realms on behalf of society and on behalf of nature. I have a university, and what we say to our students is that we've learned enough French and German and Greek and Hebrew. We need to learn the mother tongue. We need to learn how to drum again, as we'll do on Friday night. And we need to learn how to commune and, in fact, communicate with the trees and with the stones and with the water and with the wind. I believe that it will be to the degree to which we can learn the mother tongue at the moment in history when the mother is coming at civilization with a fury like Kali, that we will begin the resonance between humanity and nature that we've so fundamentally lost as we've constructed our modernity. And what that means is that people in the transpersonal movement are actually midwives. They're midwives of the future. I believe that integral theory and practice, I believe that transpersonal theory and practice may be on the margins now, but if we are to survive, will become mainstream probably sooner than we can imagine. And those of us here in this room, those of us participating in these movements around the world at this time where everything may look dark, this is the time when we have to keep faith. This is the time when we have to embody the future. Let me close with a poem from Rainer Maria Rilke, who distilled down, as he did in so many areas of human affairs, both of the mind and the heart, into a few lines: who we are and what we need to do at this moment. Time and again in history, some special people wake up. They have no ground in the crowd. They move to broader laws. They carry strange customs with them and demand room for bold and audacious action. The future speaks ruthlessly through them. They change the world. Time and again in history, some special people wake up. You're here in this room because you're awake. You're 13s in a 12 world. You have no ground in the crowd anymore, and you're looking for a new tribe. You move to broader laws. You're reaching into the invisible realms. You carry strange customs with you. How many of you have done the holotropic breath work? Those are strange customs. And you're demanding room for bold and audacious action. Why? The future is speaking ruthlessly through you, ruthlessly through us, trying to address a world in need. You will change the world. You are the midwives of the future. And it's an honor to be with you and to open up this conference in this spirit. Thank you all. I don't know what the time check is. Ludmilla wanted me to take questions if there were time. Ludmilla, I don't know whether there's any time or...
10 minutes to
No, we have a break, 5 minutes.
There's a break. Remembering of who we most essentially were at the beginning, which somehow along the way we've forgotten. And the other comment that I would make briefly before asking for further questions or comments is around learning. I'm in the process of, Stan Groff is one of our chairs of the university, along with several other people like Gene Houston and others that are well familiar to the transpersonal movement and the integral movement. When I said that it's time to create the world anew, as an educator, Having studied the Renaissance, I felt that it was a unique historical opportunity to create education anew. And even as the Renaissance moved away from the Bible and the church to human reason and the scientific method, now what was fresh and new in the 15th century has become outmoded and destructive in the 21st. So we are creating Ubiquity University on new foundations. One is the living universe. The entire universe, the earth, is a living organism. Intelligent, ethical, intentional. Everything that we are, it's because the earth is. We're also grounding it on the transpersonal vision, and we're grounding it in integral theory and practice. And we'll be launching in the spring of 2014. We believe that the time has come to reinvent education as we know it. And that's what Ubiquity University represents. I'm having a workshop, I believe it's on Friday, about new forms of learning. And so I welcome anyone who's interested in that, possibly people who would like to represent Ubiquity University in Moldova or other countries, to come to that workshop where we can actually talk about how we begin to educate a whole new generation of young people in a deeper awareness of who we really are in a transpersonal world. So any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Just a comment. I am very moved for your presentation, and I appreciate so much because seems you said something that is very perfect. No? I work with shamanism since 80s. And you are speaking about the shamanic states and about learning in shamanic states. And I think this is a very, very important suggestion, because I think there is a place where we can go to take a knowledge of the laws, and this is with this process of shamanism. I call trans-learning this process, but it's just one thing saying, so I appreciate so much. Thank you.
An additional comment about shamanism is that the reality is, which is one of the things that in our university we're really accentuating, is that the latest exploration of science are now meeting the shaman, as many of you know. So shamanism, in its broadest sense, should not be seen as antithetical to science, but is actually the direction that science is already going. And that makes the conversation much more rich. I'm sure you've all known about the work of Ervin Laszlo as a science and evolutionary systems theory on the one hand, and someone who's deeply immersed in the Akasha, in the shamanic, and in the transpersonal on the other hand. As Ken Wilber said, one never needs to exclude. One simply transcends and includes. And I think that's what Ubiquity seeks to do. I'm sure that's what the transpersonal movement is also doing. Stan Groff, who's a good friend of many of us in this room, was a trained medical doctor, a trained psychiatrist in the Czech Republic, very conservative, until he took his first tab of LSD. And then he was thrust in one experience into the shamanic realms, into the interpersonal realms, and experienced as a scientist something that he could not then explain, but which was incontrovertibly true. And that, I think, is really the grounding of the transpersonal movement that is now coming to fruition, whether it's with EUROTAS or the ITA or the ITP. And I was just talking with someone who's organizing the conference in Greece next year, which will be the first time the 16th annual EUROTAS conference that will be done in partnership with ITA, ITP. So it would be a beautiful thing to have these different aspects of the transpersonal movement come together in an island like Crete, which is so deeply resonant into the divine feminine, into Gaia, and into earth consciousness. It would be a beautiful experience, I think, for all of us to have in October of 2014, is to meet together in Greece and really go much deeper into these kinds of realms. If there are no other questions, and I want to, it's 10:30, let me tell you a story. It was an experience that I had just a couple of days ago watching a film done by Alan Herrera. I don't know how many of you know the Kogi Indians in northern Colombia. But the Kogi Indians are one of the few tribes in Latin America that were not touched by the Spanish and Portuguese conquest. They hid up in the mountains of Colombia, very remote, and stayed hidden for the last 500 years. They have no written language. They have no technology. The way that they train their shamans is when there's a particular kind of child born, through divination, they discern that this child, male or female, has a particular aptitude, and they put them in complete darkness until they reach their maturity. And they only come out of the where they are in the earth at midnight to bathe. They're carefully taught by the other shamans that are called mamas. And their whole training is how to communicate with the earth and the invisible realm. About 20 years ago, they sent a message to an individual who was there in Colombia working for the BBC. He was doing a BBC documentary on El Dorado, the search of the conquistadors for gold. And he got up into these remote areas. He heard about the Kogi and sent them a letter which he never thought would ever be replied to. And about 6 months later they said, "We've been waiting for you." and arrange for Alan to come to the Kogi. And they said, we have been hidden here for over 500 years. We've had no contact with the outside world. We're reaching out to you because there's a message that we want you to take to the world. And he did a film called The Heart of the Earth. In fact, I have a copy up in my briefcase if anyone is interested in looking at it. It's unbelievable. The communication of one of the most sophisticated human communities I've ever seen. And their message was, the world needs to know that we're doing irreparable damage to the earth. And if you're not careful, the earth is going to rise up and destroy humanity. He made the film, and then last year, the Kogi called him back to their mountaintop and said, we have a new message for the world. And he went there, and this time, he did not direct the film, they did. And I was part of the first group of people who got a chance to see it before the premiere, which is happening next week at the St. Albert or the Alberts Hall in London. It's called Luna. And there the Kogi say to all of us, the situation now is even more critical. People of goodwill must rise up because the forces of modernity, the forces of industrialization, the forces of capitalism are about ready to go beyond the point of no return. I wanted to close on this note because sometimes when we talk about climate change, sometimes when we talk about the national security state or totalitarian democracy, the new technology and the rise of what is really an emerging wisdom culture, sometimes we think it's an abstraction. It is not an abstraction. This is all happening in real time. And the situation on our planet and the precariousness of our civilization could not be more precarious. So being here at this conference, engaging in these questions of what is our human potential? What is the true meaning of education? And how do we engage in the further evolution of consciousness is not any longer simply a personal matter. This transpersonal vision, I believe, is probably the single most important movement in consciousness that the world needs. So what we do together here, how we move to Crete next year, how we take the transpersonal vision to your family, to where you work, to how you are in the world, is a matter of critical concern. The future is speaking ruthlessly through us. And we need to understand it's doing so because we need to change the world. That's the future of transpersonal. Thank you all.